My name is Elena Vance. I am 34 years old. 10 years ago, my own mother forced me onto a stage at our town's annual festival, handed me a microphone, and made me confess to stealing my grandmother's life-saving surgery fund in front of 500 people who used to be my neighbors. They didn't just exile me. They branded me a monster. My brother spat on my shoes. The local sheriff cuffed me just for show, and the crowd roared for my blood. I left that night with a single suitcase and a heart that had turned into cold, black flint. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just leaving, I was counting. And last week, when my family filed a $5 million insurance claim for their accidental mansion fire, I was the one who walked through their charred front door with the power to send them all to prison for life. I want you to freeze that frame right there. Imagine the smoke still curling from the ruins of a sprawling Victorian estate. Imagine a woman stepping out of a charcoal gray luxury SUV, wearing a tailored black suit that costs more than most people's annual rent, clutching a digital forensic tablet. Imagine the woman who was once the town thief returning as the senior lead investigator for Global Integrity Insurance. The look of absolute bone-chilling terror on my mother's face when she realized her financial salvation rested in the hands of the daughter she publicly humiliated. It was better than any lottery win. It was the sound of a decade of lies finally hitting a brick wall. But before I tell you exactly how I dismantled the Vance family legacy and exposed the rot hiding beneath the surface of my perfect hometown, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Only do it if you've ever felt the sting of being the family scapegoat, the one who carried the blame while the golden child got the glory. And drop a comment below letting me know. Have you ever had a whole group of people turn on you based on a lie? Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I read every single story because I know what it's like to feel invisible in the dark. To understand why I didn't just call the police 10 years ago, you have to understand the specific kind of psychological prison my mother, Lydia Vance, built. In Ravenwood, reputation wasn't just a word, it was currency. We were the Vances. We owned Vance & Co. Antiques, a business that had been the cornerstone of our historical town for 3 generations. My father, Arthur, had been a quiet man who lived in the shadow of my mother's ambition. Lydia was the social architect of the town, president of the garden club, head of the local charity board, and a woman who could destroy a person's social standing with a single arched eyebrow at a Sunday brunch. In our house, there was a very clear hierarchy. My older brother, Caleb, was the king. He was 3 years older than me, handsome in that typical high school quarterback sort of way, and possessed a level of entitlement that was genuinely pathological. Caleb was the future of the business. When he was 16, my parents bought him a vintage Porsche 911 to restore, which really meant they paid a mechanic to do it while Caleb took the credit. I was 16 and working 20 hours a week in the dusty, windowless basement of the antique shop, cataloging ledger entries and polishing silverware that smelled of old pennies and disappointment. My mother used to tell me that I had the Vance work ethic, but Caleb had the Vance charm. What she really meant was that I was the utility player, the one meant to work so that Caleb could shine. I was the one who remembered the customers' names, the one who identified the fake Ming vases, and the one who stayed up until 2 a.m. fixing the accounts my brother messed up. But at the dinner table, the conversation was always about Caleb's latest business idea or his mediocre football stats. I was furniture. I was a background character in the story of my own life. The breaking point began with my grandmother, Rose. She was the only one who actually saw me. She would come down to the basement of the shop, bring me a thermos of hot cocoa, and tell me that my mind was a sharper tool than any antique appraisal kit. Elena, she'd say, her eyes bright despite the cataracts, this town is a cage made of pretty lace. Don't let them convince you that you belong in the basement. In the summer of 2014, Grandmother Rose's heart started to fail. The doctors said she needed an experimental valve replacement that wasn't fully covered by insurance. The cost was $200,000. My grandmother had her own savings, a fund she had built her entire life, specifically for emergencies. She kept it in a high-yield account that required 2 signatures for large withdrawals, hers and my mother's. Lydia was the executor, the trusted daughter-in-law. But Caleb had a secret. While he was playing the role of the successful heir apparent, he was actually drowning in gambling debt. He had gotten involved with some high-stakes offshore betting sites, and by that July, he owed nearly $250,000. He didn't tell my father. He told Lydia, and Lydia, in her infinite, twisted devotion to her shining star, didn't see a criminal son. She saw a crisis that threatened the family's reputation. If the town found out the Vance heir was a gambling addict in debt to dangerous people, her social empire would crumble. I remember the night it happened. It was a humid Thursday. I had stayed late at the shop to finish the quarterly inventory. I walked into the house through the back door and heard shouting in the study. Lydia was crying, a sound I rarely heard. Caleb was pacing, his voice high and frantic. "They're going to take the car, Mom. They said they'd come to the shop. I need the money tonight." I stood in the hallway, my hand frozen on the doorframe. Then I heard Lydia's voice, cold and calculated. "The surgery fund is the only thing we have liquid. We'll take it. We'll pay it back before Rose needs the operation in September." "But what if we can't?" Caleb asked. "We will," Lydia snapped. "And if anyone asks, we'll say there was an identity theft, a digital hack. We need a fall guy, Caleb. Someone plausible." I should have walked in then. I should have recorded them. But I was 24 years old and still under the spell of the family dynamic. I was terrified. I quietly backed away and went to my room, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I convinced myself they wouldn't actually do it. I convinced myself that my mother, as much as she favored Caleb, wouldn't steal from a dying woman. I was wrong. 3 days later, the account was drained. 2 weeks after that, Grandmother Rose collapsed in the garden. When the hospital called for the down payment on the surgery, the bank delivered the news. The account was empty. The storm that followed was a masterclass in gaslighting. Lydia didn't panic. She didn't act guilty. She acted devastated. She gathered the whole family in the living room, minus Rose, who was hooked up to a ventilator, and announced that an internal audit had shown the funds were transferred out using a private laptop from within the house. "I don't want to believe it," Lydia said, her eyes welling with practiced tears as she looked directly at me. "But Elena, you're the only one who has the passwords for the shop's financial software. You're the one who handles the banking. Why did you do it, honey? Was it a boyfriend? Were you trying to run away?" I stared at her, my mouth hanging open. "What? Mom, I didn't touch that money. I heard you and Caleb talking in the study. I know he needed it for his gambling." The room went silent. Caleb stood up, his face a mask of righteous indignation. "Gambling? Elena, what are you talking about? I've been at the shop every day. You're the one who's been acting strange. You're the one who's always complaining about being invisible. Is this how you get our attention? By killing our grandmother?" He didn't just lie. He attacked. And then Lydia did something even more sinister. She pulled out a printed bank statement and my own handbag. She reached into the side pocket and pulled out a stack of cash, $10,000 in banded 50s. "I found this under your bed, Elena," she whispered, her voice sounding like a funeral bell. "The bank traced the IP address to your computer. I tried to protect you, but we can't hide this. Not when Rose is dying. They had planted it. They had used my own expertise against me. They knew I was the only one who understood the systems, so they made me the only logical suspect. They called the police, not the state troopers, but Sheriff Miller, Lydia's cousin. Miller didn't investigate. He didn't look at Caleb's phone or Lydia's browser history. He walked into our living room, looked at the money on the table, and looked at the town thief. "Ravenwood doesn't tolerate this kind of betrayal, Elena," Miller said. "Especially not to a woman like Rose. Your mother doesn't want to press formal charges because she's a saint, but the town needs to know who you really are." That was when the plan for the confession was born. It wasn't about justice. It was about public execution. Lydia told me that if I didn't stand up at the Founders Day festival and admit my shame, she would let Miller take me to the county jail and she would make sure I was prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. "Think of your brother's future," she hissed in the car on the way to the festival. "Think of the business. You've already ruined your own life. Don't take us down with you. I remember the heat of the stage lights. I remember the smell of fried dough and popcorn from the fairgrounds. I remember the sea of faces, people I had known since I was in diapers, looking at me with pure, unadulterated disgust. I stood there, holding a microphone that felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and I read the script Lydia had written for me. My name is Elena Vance, and I stole my grandmother's life. The roar of the crowd wasn't a sound. It was a physical weight. I felt the air leave my lungs. I looked down and saw Caleb smiling from the front row. I saw Lydia dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the grieving, betrayed mother to perfection. I didn't stay to hear the rest of the speeches. I walked off that stage, through the jeering crowd, and I kept walking until I reached the bus station. I had $100 in my pocket and a suitcase full of clothes. I didn't look back at the lights of Ravenwood. I didn't cry. Not then. I just felt a strange, terrifyingly calm clarity. I was dead to them. So I decided to become a ghost. And ghosts, they have all the time in the world to watch. The first 3 years in Chicago were a masterclass in the art of disappearance. Exile is a quiet thing after the noise of a mob. I remember stepping off that Greyhound bus at 4 a.m., the wind off Lake Michigan cutting through my thin jacket like a serrated blade. I had no references, a tainted name, and a heart that felt like it had been hollowed out with a melon baller. I spent the first few nights sleeping in a 24-hour laundromat, keeping my suitcase gripped between my knees, watching the rhythmic tumble of other people's clothes and wondering if I'd ever feel clean again. But as I said, I was always the utility player. I knew how to work. I found a job at a Greasy Spoon diner near the rail yards, pulling double shifts until my ankles swelled and my skin smelled permanently of old fry oil. Every cent I didn't spend on my $400 a month basement apartment went into tuition for night classes. I didn't go back for antiques or art. I went for forensic accounting. I chose that path because I realized that my mother's world, the world of lace, reputation, and social standing, was built on a foundation of shifting sand. But numbers are absolute. A ledger doesn't care if you have Vance charm or if you're the town darling. A ledger only cares if the math adds up. I became obsessed with the trail of breadcrumbs people leave behind when they try to hide their sins. I wanted to become the person who could look at $1 million corporate structure and find the one $3 mistake that brought the whole thing down. I wasn't just studying for a career. I was studying for a reckoning. By the time I was 30, I had clawed my way up to a senior position at Global Integrity Insurance. I was the person they sent in when a claim looked too perfect. I was the one who investigated the accidental warehouse fires of failing textile moguls and the mysterious art thefts of bankrupt socialites. I became known in the industry as the cold front. When I walked into a room, the liars started to sweat. They saw a woman in a sharp suit with a calm voice, but they didn't know that behind my eyes, I was still that 24-year-old girl on a stage, memorizing the faces of people who enjoyed my destruction. 2 years ago, a package arrived at my office in Chicago. There was no return address, just a postmark from a neighboring county near Ravenwood. Inside was a small, rusted tin box that smelled of lavender and old paper. I recognized it instantly. It had been Grandmother Rose's tea tin. Inside the tin was a note from Mrs. Gable, the woman who had been Rose's housekeeper for 40 years. Mrs. Gable had been the only one who didn't jeer when I left town. The note was short. Rose wanted you to have this when the time was right. She wasn't as far gone that night as they thought she was. She heard them, Elena, and she made sure the truth had a heartbeat. Underneath the note was an old-fashioned digital voice recorder, the kind Rose used to use to record her grocery lists and reminders when her eyesight started to fail. I sat in my high-rise office, the sun setting over the Chicago skyline, and I pressed play. The audio was grainy, filled with the hum of a hospital ventilator and the distant beep of monitors. But then, the voices came through. "She's stable for now," my mother's voice whispered. It was cold, even then. "Caleb, did you get the login? Did you move the funds?" "Yeah," Caleb's voice replied, sounding shaky but greedy. "It's done, $200,000. It's in the offshore account. But Mom, what about the hospital? When they find out the money is gone? We have the handbag, Lydia interrupted. I've already put the $10,000 in her side pocket. Miller is ready. The town will believe whatever I tell them, Caleb. They always do. Elena is the difficult one. She's the one who's always been jealous of your light. It's a perfect fit. Then, a faint, raspy sound. Grandmother rose. She had been awake. She had heard her own daughter and grandson plotting to steal her life-saving surgery fund and frame her favorite grandchild for it. You monsters! Rose's voice was a ghost of a sound, but the recorder had caught it. I sat in the silence of my office for an hour after the recording ended. I didn't cry. The time for tears had ended 10 years ago. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. I had the confession. I had the proof of the conspiracy. But I didn't go to the police, not yet, because I knew the Vance family. I knew Lydia wouldn't be satisfied with just $200,000. Narcissists never are. They are black holes of need, and eventually they would get hungry again. I decided to wait for them to place the next bet. I monitored them from afar. I watched through public records as Vance and Coer Antiques began to struggle. The world was changing. People didn't want dusty armoires and overpriced silverware anymore. They wanted sleek, modern, and cheap. My mother tried to pivot to lifestyle consulting, but her reputation for being a saint only worked in a small pond like Ravenwood. In the real world, she was just another overprivileged woman with a dying business. And Caleb had never stopped gambling. He had just gotten better at hiding it from Lydia. Or maybe Lydia had gotten better at lying to herself. My father, Arthur, had passed away 3 years into my exile, a broken man who probably knew the truth but was too weak to speak it. Lydia had used the life insurance to buy a massive new estate, the Highlands. It was a monument to her ego, a sprawling Victorian rebuild with enough marble to floor a cathedral. It was also a financial anchor dragging them to the bottom of the ocean. Last month, the news hit the regional insurance wire. Historic Highlands estate destroyed in late-night blaze. The report stated that the fire had started in the library, an electrical fault, according to the initial local report by none other than Sheriff Miller. The Vances had filed a claim for $5 million. It was the largest personal property claim in the state's history. When the file landed on the desk of my CEO, he called me into his office. Elena, this one is massive. The local authorities are already calling it an accident, but our risk algorithms are screaming. It's a legacy family, high social standing, lots of political pressure to pay out fast. I need our best bloodhound on this. I need you to go to Ravenwood. I looked at the folder. I saw my mother's signature on the claim form. I saw the photos of the charred ruins of the house they bought with blood money. I'll take it, I said. My voice was as steady as a heartbeat on a flat line. Let me pause here. Have you ever been handed the exact weapon you needed to finish a war you didn't start? The universe doesn't give many second chances, but it loves a good punchline. If you were me, would you have told your boss you knew the claimants? Or would you have taken the assignment in silence to ensure the investigation was truly thorough? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I drove into Ravenwood at sunset. The town looked exactly the same, quaint, picturesque, and rotting with hypocrisy. The Founders' Day stage was being erected in the square for the upcoming festival, 10 years to the day. I didn't go to a hotel. I drove straight to the site of the fire. The smell of wet ash and scorched wood hung heavy in the damp evening air. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the wind. And there, standing by the blackened remains of the front porch, were Lydia and Caleb. They were talking to a group of local reporters. Lydia draped in a dramatic black shawl, looking like a grieving queen. Caleb was standing next to her, looking impatient, checking his phone, probably checking the odds on a horse race while his mother sold the story of their tragic loss. I parked the SUV and stepped out. The click of my heels on the pavement was the only sound. Lydia turned first. She saw the luxury car, the expensive suit, the professional air. She didn't recognize me at first. She just saw a person of importance. She wiped a fake tear and put on her garden club president smile. "Hello," she said, her voice full of practiced sorrow. "Are you with the Historical Society? I'm afraid the house is—" I stopped 3 feet away from her. I took off my sunglasses and looked her dead in the eye. "Hello, Mother," I said. "I'm the senior investigator from Global Integrity. I'm here to process your claim." The silence that followed was absolute. The reporters froze. Caleb's phone slipped from his hand and hit the gravel. Lydia's face didn't just go pale, it went the color of a funeral shroud. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. "Elena," Caleb whispered, his voice cracking, "what the hell are you doing here?" "I'm doing my job, Caleb," I said, opening my tablet. "And according to my initial review of the files, your job is to explain why you purchased 3 gallons of industrial-grade accelerant at a hardware store 2 towns over last Thursday at 2 a.m. I looked at my mother, whose eyes were darting around, looking for a social escape that didn't exist. "Don't worry, Lydia," I whispered, leaning in close so only she could hear. "I brought the microphone. It's almost time for your confession." I watched the reporters lean in, their digital recorders hovering in the air like hungry insects. In a town like Ravenwood, a fire was news, but a family reunion between a pariah and a socialite was a scandal. Lydia's hand flew to her throat, her fingers clutching the vintage pearls she always wore when she needed to feel superior. I could see the frantic gears turning behind her eyes. She was trying to decide whether to hug me for the cameras or have me arrested for trespassing. "This is an outrage," Caleb blustered, stepping forward to reclaim his phone. He brushed the dirt off his designer jeans, trying to regain his quarterback swagger, but his knees were visibly shaking. "You can't just show up here and make accusations, Elena. You're biased. We'll report you to your superiors. This is a conflict of interest." I didn't blink. I simply tapped the screen of my tablet, and a digital copy of a federal authorization form appeared. "Actually, Caleb, Global Integrity has a very specific policy regarding legacy claims. Because I grew up in this house, I am considered a subject matter expert. No one knows the layout of the Highlands or the financial history of the Vances better than I do. My company didn't send me here despite our history. They sent me here because of it." I turned my gaze back to the reporters. "Ladies and gentlemen, the site is a closed federal investigation. If you stay within the yellow tape, you're obstructing an officer of the court. I suggest you move along." They didn't need to be told twice. They hurried away, sensing that the real fireworks weren't going to be on the evening news, but in the private conversations that followed. Once they were out of earshot, the mask on my mother's face finally slipped. The saint of Ravenwood evaporated, replaced by the woman who had hissed at me in the car 10 years ago. "You think you're so smart," Lydia spat, her voice a low, venomous rasp. "You come back here with your fancy suit and your cold eyes trying to punish us for a mistake you made a decade ago. We were your family, Elena. We protected you from prison." "You protected your reputation, Lydia," I corrected her, using her first name for the first time. It felt like breaking a glass ceiling. "And you didn't do a very good job of it. This house was mortgaged to the hilt. The antique shop is a hollow shell. You didn't burn this house down to start over. You burned it because the $5 million payout is the only thing standing between you and a cardboard box under a bridge." Caleb lunged toward me, but I didn't flinch. I had 2 private security contractors, former state troopers, sitting in the SUV. They stepped out the moment Caleb moved. They didn't draw weapons. They just stood there like 2 granite pillars. Caleb stopped in his tracks, his face turning a humiliated shade of beet red. "I'll be at the Ravenwood Inn," I said, sliding my sunglasses back on. "I've scheduled a formal deposition for both of you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. If you don't show, I'll recommend an immediate denial of the claim and hand my preliminary findings over to the state fire marshal. Sleep well, if the smoke doesn't keep you up." I drove away, leaving them standing in the shadow of their scorched ambition. I spent that night in a suite at the inn, the very place where my parents used to host the annual Christmas fundraiser. I sat at a small desk, the rusted tea tin sitting next to my laptop. I listened to Grandmother Rose's voice again. "You monsters." That recording was my heartbeat. It reminded me that I wasn't just here for the insurance company. I was here to finish what Rose had started. The next morning, the deposition room was a small wood-paneled library at the inn. I had arranged for a court stenographer and a fire forensics expert to be present. When Lydia and Caleb walked in, they weren't alone. They had brought Sheriff Miller. Miller was older now, his uniform straining against a stomach hardened by too much beer and too many years of small-town power. He walked in like he owned the building, tossing his hat on the table. "Now listen here, Elena," Miller began, his voice booming with the false authority of a man who's never been challenged. "I've known you since you were a sprout. I signed the report on this fire myself. It was an electrical fault, old wiring in an old house. End of story. Global integrity needs to pay up and let this family heal." I didn't look at him. I looked at the stenographer. "Please note for the record that Sheriff Miller is attempting to influence a private insurance investigation. Sheriff, unless you are here as legal counsel for the Vances, which would be a violation of your department's ethics code, I suggest you take a seat in the hallway. This is a corporate proceeding, not a town hall meeting." Miller's jaw dropped. He looked at Lydia, expecting her to save him. But Lydia was staring at me, her eyes wide with a dawning realization. She was starting to see that the girl she had broken wasn't just gone. She had been replaced by something far more dangerous. A woman who knew the rules better than the people who made them. "Leave us, Jerry," Lydia whispered to the sheriff. "But Lydia—" "Go!" she snapped. Miller huffed, grabbed his hat, and stomped out. I waited for the door to click shut before I opened my folder. "Let's talk about the library, Caleb," I said, leaning forward. "The fire started behind the east bookshelf. Your report said a lamp shorted out, but our thermal imaging shows that the heat was focused on the floorboards, not the outlet. And interestingly enough, we found traces of a very specific chemical compound, a nitrate-based accelerant used in commercial demolition. The kind you can't buy at a local store, but the kind that is used by the construction company you did consulting work for last year." Caleb started to sweat. He pulled at the collar of his polo shirt. "I don't know anything about that. I was out that night. I was at the casino across the state line. I have receipts." "I know you do," I smiled. "I also have the GPS data from your car. You were at the casino at 11 p.m. You were back at the Highlands at 1:45 a.m. And then you were back at the casino by 4 a.m. to discover the news on your phone. You're a fast driver, Caleb, but not fast enough to outrun a satellite." I turned to my mother. "And you, Lydia, you've been selling off the inventory from the antique shop under the table for months, hasn't you? Reporting them as stolen or damaged to keep the insurance money coming in. We've tracked the sales to 3 different auction houses in New York. You've been committing smaller frauds for years to keep up the Highlands mortgage. This fire was just the grand finale." Lydia slammed her hands on the table. "You're making this personal. You're just trying to get revenge because we kicked you out. You were a thief, Elena. You admitted it. You stood on that stage and told everyone." I let the silence hang for a moment. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out Grandmother Rose's digital recorder. "I remember that stage, Mother. I remember every face, but I think it's time we hear a different voice." I pressed play. The room went cold as the grainy audio filled the space. Lydia's own voice whispering about the surgery fund. Caleb's voice, greedy and desperate. And then, the final raspy condemnation from Rose. Lydia's face turned a shade of gray I didn't know a human could achieve. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. Caleb looked like he was about to vomit. "That was 10 years ago," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen pond. "The statute of limitations on the theft might have passed, but the statute on conspiracy to commit wire fraud and identity theft doesn't start until the crime is discovered. And as of this morning, Global Integrity has officially discovered the pattern of behavior that led to this fire." I stood up and closed my tablet. "The $5 million claim is denied. We are filing a civil suit for the recovery of all previous damaged goods payouts from the shop, and the FBI's white-collar crime division is waiting for you in the lobby." Lydia stood up, her chair screeching against the floor. "You can't do this. We're your family. Elena, please. We can work this out. We can give you a share. We'll tell everyone the truth. We'll fix your reputation. I walked to the door and opened it. Sheriff Miller was standing there, being handcuffed by two men in windbreakers marked FBI. My reputation doesn't need fixing, Lydia, I said. I built a new one. Yours, however, that's going to be a lot harder to restore from a federal cell. Let me pause here. The look on Caleb's face as he realized his receipts weren't going to save him was a masterpiece. Have you ever watched a lie you've lived with for a decade suddenly shatter into a million pieces? It's not a loud sound. It's a quiet, crushing weight. If you were in my shoes, would you have felt an ounce of pity? Or would you have enjoyed the silence as much as I did? Tell me in the comments. Because we're not done. The Highlands fire was just the match. Now, I'm going to show you the wildfire that burned through the rest of Ravenwood. The heavy mahogany doors of the Ravenwood Inn library didn't just close. They sealed a decade of my life away. As the click echoed, I watched through the window as Lydia and Caleb were led toward a fleet of black sedans. The townspeople, the same ones who had gathered in the town square 10 years ago to watch my public execution, were now gathering again. But this time, the cameras weren't pointed at a terrified girl in a floral dress. They were pointed at the Queen of Ravenwood, being ducked into the back seat of a federal vehicle, her hands cuffed behind her back, her dramatic silk shawl snagged on the doorframe. Sheriff Miller looked even worse. His face was a map of broken capillaries and dawning terror. He had spent 30 years treating this county like his personal kingdom, thinking his connection to the Vances made him untouchable. He didn't understand that to the federal agents standing in his lobby, he wasn't a lawman. He was just a loose end in a multi-state fraud conspiracy. I stood on the steps of the inn, the cool breeze ruffling my hair, and felt nothing. No, that's not right. I felt light. For 10 years, I had carried the weight of 500 people's judgment like a lead vest. Every time I succeeded in Chicago, a voice in the back of my head whispered, "They still think you're a thief." Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the face of the monster Lydia had created. But watching her sit in that car, stripped of her lace and her lies, the vest finally fell off. Investigator Vance? One of the agents, a sharp woman named Sarah, who I'd been coordinating with for months, walked up beside me. "We've got the primary digital assets from the Highlands server. It's worse than we thought. Your brother didn't just burn the house for the insurance. He was running a high-stakes gambling ring through the antique shop's back-end logistics software. He was laundering money for some very unpleasant people in New York." I looked at her, and a small, cold smile touched my lips. I suspected as much. Caleb was never creative enough to build a business, only greedy enough to provide a doorway for criminals. "Have you found the secondary ledger yet?" "Working on it," she said. "But your mother is already talking. She's trying to cut a deal by blaming everything on Caleb." "And Caleb? He's currently telling the transport officers that Lydia forced him to set the fire." It was the classic Vance ending. When the lights go out, they don't huddle together for warmth. They eat each other to survive. The news of the arrests rippled through Ravenwood like a tidal wave. By that afternoon, the town's Facebook group was a war zone. The Founders' Day festival preparations ground to a halt. The stage that was meant to celebrate the town's history became a monument to its greatest shame. People I hadn't seen in a decade, former teachers, neighbors, childhood friends, started showing up at the Ravenwood Inn asking for Elena. I refused to see any of them. I didn't want their apologies. I didn't want their "I always knew something was off" excuses. They hadn't known anything was off. They had enjoyed the spectacle. They had participated in the ritual of my destruction because it made them feel superior. An apology after the truth is proven isn't an act of grace. It's an act of social self-preservation. Let me pause here for a second. Have you ever had a whole group of people realize they were wrong about you, and suddenly they're falling over themselves to be your friend again? How did that feel? Did you let them back in, or did you realize that their loyalty was just as fake as the lie they believed? Drop a clean break in the comments if you've ever walked away from a crowd that didn't deserve your forgiveness. While the FBI handled the criminal side, I spent the next 3 days handling the insurance recovery. I wasn't just investigating the Highlands fire, I was auditing every single claim Vance and Kober Antiques had filed over the last 10 years. I found missing heirlooms that were actually sitting in storage units in New Jersey. I found damaged furniture that Lydia had sold to private collectors before filing for the total loss. By Wednesday, the total amount of proven fraud reached $3 million. Global Integrity Insurance wasn't just denying the new claim, we were clawing back every cent they had ever stolen. I was sitting in my suite reviewing the final recovery notices when a knock came at the door. I expected another concerned neighbor. Instead, when I opened the door, I found Mrs. Gable, Grandmother Rose's old housekeeper. She looked older, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes were still as sharp as a hawk's. She didn't say a word, she just reached out and pulled me into a hug. She smelled like lavender and peppermint tea, the smell of the only safety I'd known as a child. "You did it, Elena," she whispered into my shoulder. "You brought the sun back to this house." "I just did the math, Mrs. Gable," I said, my voice cracking for the first time. "No," she pulled back, holding my face in her hands. "You did the justice. Your grandmother?" She knew. She kept that recorder under her pillow for 2 days before she died, waiting for me to find it. She told me, "Elena is a fighter. She'll come back for the truth when she's strong enough to hold it." Mrs. Gable stayed for an hour. She told me what the town had been like after I left, how Lydia had turned the thief story into a legendary tale of her own resilience, how Caleb had become a local hero for saving the business while I was gone. And then she told me about the one thing I hadn't known. "The Highlands estate wasn't just a house, Elena," Mrs. Gable said. "Lydia bought the land with the money from Rose's surgery fund, but she put the deed in a trust that had a very specific clause." My breath hitched. "What clause?" "Your father, Arthur. He might have been weak, but he wasn't stupid. He knew what Lydia was capable of. He added a provision that if the primary executor was ever convicted of a felony involving the family's assets, the trust would dissolve and the remaining equity would bypass the spouse and go directly to the eldest surviving heir who wasn't involved in the crime." I stared at her. The math was clicking into place. If Lydia and Caleb were convicted of conspiracy and fraud, which was now a certainty, I wouldn't just be the investigator on the case. I would be the legal owner of the charred land they were trying to profit from. The irony was so sharp it felt like a physical sting. Lydia had spent 10 years trying to make me disappear so she could keep the money, only to trigger a legal mechanism that would give me everything because she couldn't stop being a criminal. The Founders' Day festival arrived on Friday. It was the 10th anniversary of my exile. I decided it was time to make my final appearance. I didn't wear a dress this time. I wore my charcoal gray power suit, my heels clicking on the cobblestones of the town square. The festival was subdued. There were no cheers, no music. The town was in a state of collective mourning for their own reputation. I walked toward the stage. A crowd began to form, whispering, pointing. I saw the board members of the Historical Society, the same men who had stood on that stage with Lydia, looking at their shoes as I passed. I didn't ask for the microphone. I just stood at the base of the stage and looked up at the spot where I had once stood and told a lie that broke my soul. Lydia was in the county jail, waiting for federal transport. Caleb was in the cell next to her, still trying to blame the accelerant on a faulty furnace he hadn't serviced. Miller was in an orange jumpsuit, his badge currently sitting in an evidence bag at the FBI headquarters. I pulled out my phone and called my office. "Execute the final notices," I said, and claw it all back, every cent. As I turned to leave the square, a man stepped in front of me. It was Mr. Harrison, the head of the Ravenwood Bank. He looked pale, his suit rumpled. "Elena," he said, his voice trembling, the board, we wanted to offer a formal apology. We realize now that we were misled. We'd like to host a ceremony to restore your name. We'll put a plaque in the square." I stopped him with a single look. "You don't get it, Mr. Harrison," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet square. "You didn't realize anything. You were shown. There's a difference. You didn't apologize when I was a 24-year-old girl with a suitcase. You apologized when I became a senior lead investigator for a multi-billion-dollar corporation with the power to freeze your bank's assets. You're not sorry for what you did to me. You're sorry that I grew up to be the person who caught you." The square went dead silent. Harrison's mouth opened and closed, his face turning a deep, embarrassed red. "Save your plaque," I said, stepping past him. "I don't need a piece of brass to tell me who I am. I already have the receipts." I walked to my SUV, the security guards opening the door for me. As I pulled away from Ravenwood, I looked in the rearview mirror. The stage was still there, empty and hollow. I felt a sense of peace I didn't know was possible. The wildfire was over. The rot was gone. And as the town of Ravenwood faded into the distance, I realized that I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was the architect of a new foundation. But there was one final document to sign. One final meeting that would turn the ashes of the Highlands into the seeds of something truly devastating for the Vance legacy. The drive back to the Regional Legal Center in Hartford felt like a funeral procession for a ghost I'd finally laid to rest. I watched the rolling hills of Connecticut pass by the window, the autumn leaves turning into a blur of orange and gold, the same colors as the flames that had finally consumed the Highlands. It was fitting, I suppose. The house had been built on a foundation of stolen time and fraudulent dreams, and now that foundation was officially mine to demolish. I met Mr. Abernathy in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the city skyline. Abernathy was a man of 80, a contemporary of my grandfather's who had been the silent executor of the secondary Vance Trust. He was a man who believed in the sanctity of the law and the stain of a bad reputation. When I walked in, he didn't offer a handshake. He offered a slight, respectful bow of the head. "I have spent 40 years watching your mother curate a garden of lies, Elena," Abernathy said, his voice sounding like dry parchment. "Your father, Arthur, came to me 6 months before he passed. He was a man dying of a broken heart and a heavy conscience. He knew he was too weak to stand up to Lydia, but he wanted to make sure the truth had a legal avenue to escape. He added the felony clause. He said to me, 'One day, Lydia and Caleb will try to fly too close to the sun, and they will burn. When that happens, I want Elena to be the one who owns the ashes.'" Abernathy slid a heavy fountain pen across the table toward me. In front of me was the transfer of title and dissolution of trust. By signing this, I was officially taking possession of the Highlands land, the remaining assets of Vance & Co. Antiques, and the $1.2 million that remained in the family's primary investment account, the money Lydia had tried so desperately to protect. "They're finished, Elena," Abernathy continued. "Global Integrity's clawback suit has already been filed. The federal government is seizing the offshore accounts Caleb used for the gambling ring. By the time the sentencing is over, Lydia and Caleb won't just be in prison, they will be penniless. The Vance legacy is currently a negative balance on a ledger." I picked up the pen. It was heavy, gold-plated, and engraved with my grandfather's initials. I felt a surge of energy as the ink hit the paper. I signed my name, Elena Vance, slowly and clearly. I didn't feel like a victor in a war. I felt like a surgeon removing a tumor. The Vance name had been a malignant growth in my life for 34 years, and with a single stroke of a pen, I had finally excised it. "What will you do with the land?" Abernathy asked as he witnessed the signature. "I'm going to do what the town should have done 10 years ago," I said. "I'm going to turn it into something useful." But before the construction crews arrived, I had one final obligation. I had to see the woman who started the wildfire. I visited the county jail the following Tuesday. The facility was a grim, gray concrete block, a far cry from the Victorian parlors and manicured lawns Lydia had spent her life defending. The air inside smelled of industrial bleach and stagnant despair. I sat in a small booth separated by a thick pane of scratched plexiglass. When the door opened and Lydia was let in, I had to suppress a gasp. She was wearing a rough orange jumpsuit that washed out her skin, making her look sallow and brittle. Her hair, which she usually kept in a perfect ash blonde bob, was limp and turning gray at the roots. She had no makeup, no pearls, no suit of armor. She looked like exactly what she was, a 70-year-old woman who had gambled her soul and lost. She sat down, her movements stiff and defensive. She didn't look at me at first. She stared at the wall, her jaw set in that familiar, stubborn line. "I assume you're here to gloat?" Lydia spat, her voice sounding thin and sharp. "I assume you want me to beg for your forgiveness so you can feel superior in that expensive suit your company bought you." "I don't need to feel superior, Lydia," I said, my voice echoing in the small room. "The facts of the case have already established that. I'm here to give you a status update on your claim." Lydia's eyes flickered to mine, a spark of the old desperation igniting in them. "The insurance? Harrison said if we could prove the wiring was old—" "The claim is dead," I interrupted. "And so is the trust. I signed the transfer papers this morning. I own the Highlands. I own the shop. And I've already instructed Abernathy to begin the liquidation of every stick of furniture you had hidden in those storage units." Lydia slammed her hands against the plexiglass, the sound ringing through the room. "You can't do that. That's my life. I built that reputation. I protected this family for decades while you were busy being a difficult child." "You didn't protect anyone," I said, leaning closer to the glass. "You poisoned Grandmother Rose. You turned your son into a criminal, and you tried to bury me alive. You didn't build a reputation, Lydia. You built a prison. I just happened to be the one who realized I had the keys to leave." Lydia started to cry, real tears this time, not the practiced ones from the stage. She looked small and pathetic, her shoulders shaking under the orange fabric. "What about Caleb?" she whimpered. "He's my boy, Elena. He's your brother. He's not strong like you. He won't survive in a place like this." "Caleb is 37 years old," I said. "He's a man who made choices. He chose to gamble. He chose to frame his sister. He chose to burn a house down for money he didn't earn. He's not a boy, Lydia. He's a consequence." I stood up, sliding my chair back. I felt a profound sense of closure. The woman across from me was no longer the terrifying social architect of my childhood. She was just a stranger in a jumpsuit. "One more thing," I said, pausing at the door. "I'm demolishing the Highlands. The wrecking ball arrives on Monday, and I've already contacted a nonprofit in Hartford. We're building a regional domestic violence shelter on the land. It's going to be named Rose's House. Her name is going to represent safety now, not a surgery fund you can steal." Lydia let out a long, agonizing wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief for the world she'd lost. I didn't turn back. I walked out of the visiting room, through the heavy steel gates, and into the afternoon sun. Looking at my mother in that orange jumpsuit, knowing that I was the one who had finally stripped away her power, did I feel guilty? For years, therapists and well-meaning friends had told me that forgiveness is the only way to heal. But standing there, I realized they were wrong. Justice is the only way to heal. Accountability is the only way to heal. Forgiveness is a gift you give to people who deserve it. To everyone else, you give the truth. Have you ever been told you were bitter or resentful for holding someone accountable? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear how you stood your ground. Because we're at the end now. The Vance legacy is a pile of ash, the Highland land is a construction site, and the ghost of Jade has a new name. But there is one final piece of the story, a letter I found in the back of the antique shop's safe that changed the way I look at my father forever. I walked into Vance & Coder Antiques one last time on a Thursday morning. The shop, which had once been the beating heart of Ravenwood's social life, was now a hollow, echoing vault. The air was thick with the scent of old cedar, lemon oil, and the stagnant dust of a century of people's discarded belongings. It felt like walking through a graveyard of other people's memories. I was there to oversee the final inventory before the contents were auctioned off to pay for the Global Integrity Recovery suit. In the back office, the heavy iron safe stood open. I had already retrieved the files and the ledgers, but as I was clearing out the bottom shelf, my fingers brushed against a velvet lining that felt loose. I pulled it back, and there, hidden in a false bottom, was a thick, cream-colored envelope addressed to Elena. My father's handwriting was unmistakable. The precise, shaky script of a man who spent his life measuring words he was too afraid to speak. I sat on his old leather chair, the springs groaning under me, and opened it. Inside were 3 things: a small brass key, a flash drive, and a letter dated 2 days before his death. Elena, the letter began. By the time you find this, the wildfire will have likely reached the highlands. I am writing this because I was a coward. I watched your mother and Caleb build a stage for your destruction, and I stayed in the wings. I told myself I was keeping the peace, but peace without truth is just a decorated grave. I knew you didn't take Rose's money. I knew the night the accounts were drained because I saw the transfer on Lydia's laptop. I didn't stop her because I was afraid of her. I was afraid of the noise, the scandal, the way she could turn a house into a battlefield. For that, I will never forgive myself. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. He knew. He had always known. But I didn't just watch, the letter continued. I spent the last 3 years of my life being a ghost in my own house. The flash drive contains every email, every recorded conversation, and every fraudulent ledger entry your mother and Caleb ever made. I documented it all. I knew they would try to erase you, so I made sure you were the only one who could eventually write the ending. The brass key is for a safety deposit box in Chicago. It contains the original, unedited deed to the Highlands property. I never told Lydia I had it. It was my insurance policy for you. You were the only Vance charm we actually had, Elena. Caleb was just a reflection of our sins. I am sorry I didn't stand on that stage with you 10 years ago. I hope one day you can stand on your own and own the world they tried to steal from you. I stared at the letter for a long time. My father hadn't been a hero, but he hadn't been a complete bystander either. He had been a silent archivist of his own shame, building a legal guillotine for his wife and son and handing me the rope. I tucked the flash drive into my pocket. The evidence I'd already gathered was enough to sink them, but this was the absolute, undeniable proof that would ensure they never saw the light of a social gala ever again. The federal sentencing took place in December, exactly 10 years and 4 months after the Founders' Day festival. The courtroom was packed with Ravenwood residents who had driven in to watch the final act of the Vance tragedy. The mood was somber, a stark contrast to the festive atmosphere of the fairgrounds a decade earlier. Lydia sat at the defense table, her shoulders hunched, looking older than the stones in the town square. Caleb sat next to her, his jaw working as he stared at the floor. He had spent the last 3 months trying to blame everything on youthful mistakes and maternal pressure. But the records on the flash drive, his voice laughing about the gambling ring, his messages to offshore bookies had silenced every defense he had. Sheriff Miller was sentenced first. For his role in the fraud, the civil rights violations, and the obstruction of justice, he received 12 years in a federal penitentiary. He was led out in silence, his head bowed, the man who once cuffed me for show now feeling the real weight of the steel. Then came Caleb. The judge didn't hold back. "You didn't just commit fraud, Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You systematically dismantled the life of your own sister to fund a lifestyle you didn't earn. You are a predator dressed in designer clothes." Caleb was sentenced to 15 years for arson, wire fraud, and money laundering. And then, Lydia. She stood to receive her sentence, her eyes darting to me for one final moment of manipulation. I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I sat in the front row, the ghost of Jade, and watched as the woman who made me a monster was finally named one by the state. For conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement of a trust, Lydia Vance was sentenced to 10 years. As she was being led away, she stopped in front of me, the guards tugging at her arms. "You think you won?" she hissed, her voice a dry, desperate rattle. "But you're still a Vance, Elena. You're just like me. You destroyed your family for a ledger." I stood up, smoothing the front of my black suit. "No, Lydia," I said, my voice calm and clear enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "I didn't destroy this family. I just stopped helping you hide the ruins. There's a difference." The wrecking ball arrived at the Highlands estate the following Monday. I stood on the edge of the property, Mrs. Gable standing beside me as the first blow hit the library wall. The Victorian lace, the marble floors, the St. Lydia portrait, it all crumbled into a cloud of white dust. By sunset, the Highlands was a vacant lot. The prison was gone. 6 months later, the town of Ravenwood looked different. Vance and Coer Antiques was gone, replaced by a community art center, but the biggest change was on the hill where the Highlands once stood. A modern 3-story building made of glass and warm wood had risen from the ashes. It was surrounded by a garden of lavender and peppermint, Rose's favorites. The sign at the entrance read, "Rose's House, a sanctuary for resilience." The opening ceremony was quiet. There were no microphones, no stages, and no scripts. I stood on the porch, watching a woman and her 2 young children walk through the front door, their faces filled with the first flicker of safety they'd known in years. I looked out over the town of Ravenwood. I didn't feel like a pariah anymore. I didn't even feel like an investigator. I felt like a person who had finally found the math that made sense. Thank you for staying with me through this entire story. If it gave you the strength to set your own boundaries or the hope to survive your own storm, please like, subscribe, and share this video.